So Rachel, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meredith. And I want to extend my thanks to the entire Climate Links team. Sophie, thanks for all of the back-end work you're doing here today. It's been really wonderful collaborating with all of you to organize this. This is a great topic. And I'm so excited for all of you who are here joining us to hear from this amazing group of panelists that we have, and we'll be introducing them throughout the performance. So really, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us and for being here with us. We have a really packed agenda, so I think we'll jump right into it. And we can go to the next slide, please. So here's the lineup for today. We'll start, I will offer some general context for USAID's localization agenda and how we are approaching this concept now. Then I'll hand things over to Lauren Baker, a senior policy analyst in PPL, who's going to talk more specifically about how the climate strategy addresses localization and locally led development. We also have Anne Vaughn here with us to reiterate the importance of locally led adaptation, more specifically in this work. Then we're going to transition to our three panelists who will be sharing their perspectives from USAID Kenya, USAID South American Regional Mission, and our Office of Acquisition and Assistance here in Washington. And our hope is that you all will come away from those three presentations with a very real and tangible sense of what this work looks like in practice and some of the ways that we can all diversify our partnerships and engage more local actors in our efforts to tackle the climate crisis. And if that isn't crystal clear, though, by the end of those presentations, we'll definitely have some time at the end for your Q&A. So as you have questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll be moderating that at the end. So with that, let's take a step back and sort of set the scene for this conversation. Thanks, Sophie. So as many of you probably already know, in November 2021, almost a year ago, Administrator Power announced a new commitment to accelerate efforts to make USAID's work more inclusive, more equitable, and more responsive to the needs, priorities, and ideas of the diverse communities and people in the countries in which we work. And central to this vision is the need to change relationships and power dynamics so that local actors are at the center of our work. To advance these goals, USAID is reevaluating our core business processes, our staffing, the skill sets and priorities that we have so that we can all more effectively foster local leadership and ownership of the development process. So this process and set of actions that USAID is undertaking that I just referred to is what we mean when we say localization. And I think it's important to distinguish localization from locally led development. So as I've just described, localization is a process. It is a means to an end, but it is not an end in and of itself. The end or the ultimate goal is locally led development. And localization is the process or approach by which we aim to achieve that goal. And while neither of these terms are brand new, what's different this time is that we are drawing on all of the lessons of our previous efforts, such as local solutions and the journey to self-reliance, and taking them even further by framing this current iteration in a more holistic and comprehensive way that looks beyond partnering alone, although partnering and direct local funding remain a priority. And this time we really aim to also address issues such as power dynamics, organizational change, staffing challenges, and shifting mindsets. Now, because we're aiming to be so ambitious and comprehensive this time around, that also means that it can get a bit complicated. So as we shift to the next slide, we can dig in a bit more so that we can better understand what we mean when we talk about this process of localization. So our approach has four overlapping lines of effort. First, we are adapting our policies and programs to foster locally sustained change that is tied to each country's unique political, social, cultural, economic, and environmental contexts. In pursuit of locally led development, we will apply local capacity strengthening efforts, taking an asset-based approach that emphasizes the existing capacities and priorities of local actors. And we'll also use systems thinking to better understand the local contexts in which we operate. Second, we want to shift power to local actors and ensure that they play a significant and meaningful role throughout all of our acquisition, assistance, and program cycle processes. Our work with our colleagues in the Inclusive Development Hub is especially important for this line of effort. Localization without inclusion has the potential to reinforce discrimination or unequal power structures in local contexts. But likewise, inclusion without localization may not be as effective at centering decision-making with local actors or strengthening local systems. But at their best, together, localization and inclusive development approaches create a virtuous cycle that strengthens our ability to realize the principle, nothing about us without us. And to hold ourselves accountable to this goal, USAID has set a target that by 2030, 50% of all our activities will place local actors in the lead of co-designing, planning, implementing, or evaluating our programs. Third, we will channel a larger portion of assistance directly to local partners while ensuring accountability for the appropriate use of funds and achievement of results. This will build on current efforts such as Local Works, the New Partnerships Initiative, and PEPFAR's Local Partner Transition, but also expand beyond these initiatives. And to hold ourselves accountable to this goal, USAID has set a target that by the end of fiscal year 2025, 25% of all of our programmatic funding will go directly to local actors. And this 25% target will only capture one small part of our localization efforts. Again, those direct awards to local partners. But effective localization requires a much broader mix of approaches, such as government-to-government assistance, local capacity strengthening, expanding the use of sub-awards to a more diverse range of local partners as well, and many others. We need to be sure that we're bringing every tool in our toolbox to bear in order for this effort to be a success. And finally, USAID will serve as a public advocate and thought leader at the global and country level, using our convening authority, partnerships, voice, and the power of example to catalyze a broader shift toward more locally led development. For example, just later today, USAID is going to be co-hosting a donor roundtable at the World Bank annual meetings on how to build momentum and advance donor implementation of the principles for locally led adaptation that were launched at the Climate Adaptation Summit in January of 2021. In all of our advocacy efforts, we are collaborating with Southern-led civil society groups and coalitions to ensure that they take a lead in these international conversations on localization and advancing locally led development. In a moment, I will pass the virtual mic to Lauren to discuss what all of this looks like in the climate space. But before I do, I want to reiterate two things. So first, localization is a how, not a what. So as we'll discuss today, localization has powerful implications for our climate change work and for all of the sectors that USAID works in. It is not a standalone or an extra activity, but rather should be seen as a guide for how we should do all of our work. Again, first and foremost, localization is about a mindset shift. And second, this localization agenda is the latest iteration in a line of decades of work, and it reflects months of intensive consultations and processing of lessons learned from those previous efforts. And so we're going to continue to hold the importance of that kind of learning and adapting at the heart of everything that we do. And events like this one are extremely valuable touch points for us to hear from you all about challenges and opportunities and ways that we can collectively improve and advance these goals. So thank you all again for being here and for being such valuable partners and stakeholders in advancing both of these agency priorities, localization and climate. And so with that, I have the honor of introducing my colleague, Dr. Lauren Baker. Lauren is a senior policy analyst in the Office of Policy in the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. She serves as an inclusive development and environment advisor and contributed to the development of USAID's new climate strategy, as well as USAID's policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples. She also served as a coordinator for an agency learning agenda question on how to more meaningfully integrate more local voices, priorities, and contributions into USAID's work. As a member of the Office of Policy's Foreign Policy Engagement Team, Dr. Baker regularly coordinates with others at USAID, the National Security Council, and the interagency to advance policy priorities for USAID and the USG. Lauren, welcome, and over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for those opening words and the introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. And thank you for joining this webinar today. It is just wonderful to see people calling in from all around the world. And as we'll note throughout this presentation, your leadership, your role is key to sustainable and equitable climate actions. As Rachel noted, it is hard to overstate the importance of localization to USAID at this time. Administrator Power is deeply committed to localization and locally led development, as well as to tackling the climate crisis and enhancing inclusive development. So today I'll highlight how the climate strategy also pulls together these threads, elevating attention to locally led development and equity and inclusion as two of its foundational principles. Next slide. The commitment to locally led development permeates all parts of the climate strategy, from our strategic objectives to our targets, our intermediate results and the associated actions, and our roadmap to implementation. Throughout this presentation, I will share excerpts and draw your attention to various parts of the climate strategy that reinforce the agency's commitment to locally led development and supporting partner priorities. And on this slide, I've circled some of the specific strategy components that I'll touch on throughout this presentation. Next slide. So first and foremost, locally led development is one of the 5 foundational principles of the climate strategy. As with all of the cross-cutting principles, USAID is committed to incorporating locally led development into all of our planning and activities associated with the strategy. This slide shares the full text of that principle. As you can see, sustainable and equitable climate action should be locally led, owned, and implemented, defer decision-making authority, focus on respecting and protecting rights, etc. As you can see, there's a lot packed into this one principle, including a number of distinct aspects and components. So in this presentation, I'll talk through 3 of the key elements of the principle. First, looking at commitment to local ownership and leadership, then highlighting the importance of rights and local knowledge, and finally, I'll note the importance of tailoring climate actions to local contexts. So here's the first component. The most central and critical element of the locally led development principle is that sustainable and equitable climate actions should be locally led, owned, and implemented, and defer decision-making authority and leadership to local actors to the greatest extent possible. This relates to a broad theory of change, that in order for actions to be both sustainable and equitable, they must be locally led, owned, and implemented. In other words, we do not think it is possible for climate actions to be either sustainable or equitable without being driven by local systems and local change agents. These local actors can take many forms. As the principle states, local actors can include governments of all levels, local private sector actors, universities and indigenous peoples, and local communities. Part of deferring decision-making is recognizing that many of these actors already have their own priorities, and our role is to support and uplift those. Next slide. As you may be aware, the climate strategy has 2 strategic objectives. One is about accelerating and scaling targeted climate actions, and the other is about catalyzing systems change and transformative shifts to net zero and climate resilient pathways. For both, we're committed to partnering with a range of local actors on locally led development efforts to address the climate crisis or achieve locally determined goals. We are also committed across both strategic objectives to build on and support our partners' climate plans, policies, and strategies. Next slide. The strategy also sets 6 targets that we aim to achieve by 2030. Notably, one of these targets is to support at least 80 countries as they implement their own commitments on mitigation and adaptation, such as through their NDCs, their nationally determined contributions, and NAPs, the National Adaptation Plans. This is yet another clear commitment to supporting our partners' own priorities and plans. Next slide. So returning back to the locally led development principle, we also see that sustainable and equitable climate actions should adhere to free, prior, and informed consent, focus on respecting and protecting rights and enabling self-determined development, and ensure that local knowledge and expertise drive USAID's work. We believe it is critical to take a rights-based approach. And this is particularly the case when working with Indigenous peoples and local communities, in line with both the climate strategy and USAID's policy on promoting the rights of Indigenous peoples. We are committed to respect and protect rights ourselves and make good faith efforts to shift power to local actors, avoid unintended harm, consult and partner with those most vulnerable to climate change, co-create solutions, seek free, prior, and informed consent as appropriate, and maximize local benefits. Next slide. Our commitment to respecting and protecting rights is nowhere clearer than in Intermediate Result 1.4 of the climate strategy. Partner with Indigenous peoples and local communities to lead climate action. As part of these efforts, we will support the enabling environment for tenure rights, resource rights, and human rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, including environmental defenders. In addition to this IR focused on Indigenous peoples and local communities, IR 1.5 in the climate strategy focuses on ways we will enable and empower women and youth and other marginalized and underrepresented groups to lead climate action. IR 1.5 yet again reinforces our commitments to increase the agency and leadership of key local actors, including women and youth, as positive agents of change. Next slide. These commitments to rights-based approaches, empowerment and inclusion, and to ensure that local knowledge and expertise drive USAID's work also relate to and are elevated in two of the other foundational principles in the climate strategy. In the equity and inclusion principle, USAID commits to center our actions in inclusive approaches in which local communities and marginalized groups are meaningfully engaged as climate change agents, while also confronting entrenched power structures that maintain inequalities. And our principle on evidence and innovation notes that we will work closely with a range of people, including and especially local experts, and leverage local knowledge and practice to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. Next slide. Returning one last time to the locally led development principle, the strategy notes that sustainable and equitable climate actions should be tailored and context appropriate. Context is critical. No two contexts are exactly the same. And while climate change is undoubtedly a global issue that needs global coordination to tackle, the way that impacts play out, the confluence with other global challenges, the opportunities for sustainable and equitable climate actions, they're all deeply local and context specific, and thus we are committed to tailored responses. As the climate strategy states, the exact interventions USAID undertakes will depend on the local context and partner priorities, and prioritization will occur at the regional, national, and local levels in consultation with our partners. Next slide. Intermediate Result 1.2 in the strategy also speaks to the importance of locally led development that is highly tailored to context. For example, actions under this adaptation intermediate result include, but are not limited to, working within the unique local community context to understand and reduce climate risks, and ensuring that early actions in climate services are tailored to a user's expressed needs. Next slide. Finally, I will draw your attention to commitments in the climate strategy's roadmap to implementation, notably our support for flexible funding and implementing mechanisms to enable locally led development, and that we will consider opportunities to support partner country priorities and needs through locally led development when prioritizing our direct climate funds. So, to conclude, USAID is deeply committed to locally led development as a core principle for implementation of our climate strategy, and this commitment is reiterated in many ways throughout the strategy. As Rachel noted, this is not a side issue. It is core to how we intend to work on climate and as an agency writ large. And with that, I'll now turn the floor over to Anne Vaughn to talk more specifically about our commitments to locally led adaptation. Anne Vaughn is a senior advisor for climate change in our Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. So thanks so much. Take care.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. Really appreciate it, and a great and exciting overview of our climate change strategy. I will briefly touch on the principles for locally led adaptation, which I hope you all can see on the screen, and highlight 8 different principles that advance locally led adaptation. And why this is important, why we have locally led solutions and local leadership throughout both our climate strategy and other strategies that Lauren has mentioned, is because we know it matters to get better development outcomes when we have people at the center of our work. And we think that's particularly important in climate action, especially adaptation. And we have a couple problems that we're trying to fix when it comes to elevating locally led action in adaptation. Specifically, as some research has found from a couple of years ago, only about 10% of climate finance reaches local levels. So one of the things that we're focused on is trying on principle number 1 is to devolve decision-making to the lowest appropriate level. And this would include trying to make sure we're crowding in more finance and decisions about finance down to local levels. USAID endorsed all of these 8 principles at last year's COP26 in Scotland, and are working on implementing these as we move forward with the implementation of the climate strategy. And both governments and civil society can sign on to these principles. So would encourage those of you interested in advancing these objectives and making sure we're incorporating these principles into our work to consider signing on and joining us in our efforts to try to make sure we have everything from decision-making being done at the lowest levels to making sure we're understanding and helping communities understand climate risks and uncertainty. So thanks. I just wanted to give this quick overview, encourage folks to dig into this more. We'll put a link in the chat with further information, but back over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne and Lauren, for both providing some more of that context and sort of this important intersection between our locally led development efforts and the climate strategy and the broader climate portfolio at USAID. So now I know we're all very eager to hear from our 3 panelists. So first I will introduce Chihenyo Kangara. Chihenyo is USAID Kenya's Environment Office Climate and Resilience Team Lead. She has worked for USAID for the last 9 years and has over 15 years of experience working across East Africa in environmental planning and management, climate change, agriculture, and water and marine ecology. And she currently manages a portfolio of both regional and national climate resilience activities in the mission. So over to you, Chihenyo, and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that opening remarks as well. So USAID Kenya East Africa, through our existing CDCS, is already fostering local-led development and accelerating private sector engagement across its development programs in Kenya. Now, in order to achieve and sustain the localization agenda in Kenya and the region, USAID Kenya CDCS takes an integrated approach, focusing on local actors, thus empowering Kenyans to drive their own economic growth at the local, subnational, and regional levels. As we gear towards operationalizing the climate strategy in Kenya and across the region, I would like to stress that the Environment Office, for example, its portfolio is already making strides in implementing components of the agency's climate strategy. We are already focusing on IR 1.2, which is building climate resilience, 1.3, mobilizing finance, 1.4 and 5, partnering and amplifying local actors. Next slide. And next, yes. So when we look at the journey, the USAID Environment Office localization journey, just a little context to this is that 75% of Kenya's wildlife resides in communal lands outside protected areas, spanning landscapes traversing areas even beyond counties, if you understand Kenya's administration structure. Conservancies are therefore set up in response to the needs of communities to coexist with wildlife. They're also set up to promote local-led development and sustain livelihoods. USAID has played critical roles over the years in collaborating with key stakeholders in designing and scaling up these conservancies across key landscapes. Community conservancies are now evidently seen as local key platforms for good governance, peace and stability, natural resource management, economic development, and community youth empowerment. Efforts within USAID's Kenya Environment Office, it really evolves around ensuring local solutions are co-created with key local partners in a bid to promote environmental sustainability in a changing climate context. All our Kenyan environment activities are 100% co-created with and managed by local partners. So this journey, that's as you can see from that slide, began way back, really in the 1980s to 1990s, and is expanded since 2004 when we started funding the Northern Rangelands Trust. And the investments over time versus today, you can clearly see that we have moved more towards fixed awards that really provide direct funding towards these local entities. Next slide. So for the purpose of this webinar, let us just hone into one project up north, known as the Northern Kenya Grasslands Carbon Project, which aims to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by implementing sustainable grazing management over 2 million hectares of Northern Kenya's savannas and grasslands. This project is fully implemented by a local NGO, as I said earlier on, entitled Northern Rangelands Trust, and community members across 14 conservancies. Now, for those who might be aware, there are about 237 conservancies across key landscapes in Kenya. And this project intends to improve pasture for livestock and wildlife. It also intends to make rangelands more drought resilient and generates a new revenue stream for communities that live within these areas. Next slide. So the project is the world's first large-scale grassland soil carbon project. It is also the first project to work with pastoralist communities who use land and resources communally. It is the first project generating carbon credits reliant on modified livestock grazing practices. And it's also the first project focused entirely on soil removals and the first to use modeled rather than measured removals. It's a triple gold accredited for benefits to communities, climate, and biodiversity under the CCB standards. It is robust, and it took 4 years to complete validation in terms of methodology, and will be the first in terms of the VERs that have been credible and verifiable. Now, in terms of methodology, this is still a very unique project because it is it's pioneering a methodology that has not been used before and was also validated by VCS. And currently, we're getting to see residual credits being put out. Next slide. So it is very significant because the first issue of these credits have been during the period of 2013 to 2016, and they were verified in December 2020. The whole issue sold in 2021 and generated $14.6 million for the participating conservancies, which is representing 60% of total sales revenue. Please note that this is expected to increase to at least 69% from the second issue. Now, each participating conservancy receives approximately $325,000 in the year 2022, and they will receive a similar amount in 2023 and 2024 as per the revenue share arrangements that have been agreed with communities prior to the sale of credits in 2021. The second issue for the period 2017 to 2020 is now nearing completion and is expected early quarter 2022. A similar number of credits are expected to be generated from this vintage period. The project will generate $300 million, and this is a conservative estimate for the conservancies, but could be even as high as $1 billion US dollars, if the price of carbon continues to be supported in the market. Now, the emphasis here is that management of the project and expenditure of the funds is entirely and totally done by the communities, therefore enhancing ownership and resilience of these landscapes. Next slide. So most importantly is that through this project, we are strengthening ecosystem-based adaptation, and rangeland management as well is being restored through the collective grazing plans that have been developed by the communities, originating at the village level and again coordinated all the way to the landscape level. The grazing plans have also been well zoned out for wet seasons versus zoned out for dry season grazing. And also the communities practice rotational grazing, ensuring rest and recovery periods for the rangelands, which is all very critical when we think about ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change. And carbon financing, therefore, then provides an incentive for change in terms of revenue, as well as funding restoration focused engagements. Thank you so much. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Chihenyo, for that presentation. And I also want to encourage folks to continue putting your questions in the chat. I know each of our panelists are going to be presenting a lot of rich information, such as that amazing example that Chihenyo just shared. So if you have specific examples or questions rather for each of these examples, please do feel free to be putting those in the Q&A throughout the presentations. But for now, let's pivot over to another part of the world. I'm honored to introduce Monica Romo. Monica is an ecologist working as a regional Amazon environment specialist with 11 years of experience at USAID. And she has more than 35 years of experience in strategic planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of conservation, sustainable development, and Indigenous peoples projects. And these days, she is the agreement officer for 3 projects working with Indigenous peoples. So Monica, I will pass things over to you.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank everybody for being here this morning. I'm going to talk about mainly about a project that I manage that is called AIR, Amazon Indigenous Rights and Resources, but also mentioned what our regional program and their bilateral program in Peru is doing to improve localization and participation of Indigenous people in our project. Next. Well, as everybody mentioned before, these are the climate change strategic framework. And the one that I'm going to refer especially is the IR4, that is partner with Indigenous peoples and local communities to lead climate action. And of course, enable and empower women and youth and other marginalized and underrepresented groups to lead climate action. This is the case of Indigenous peoples in the Amazon, in particular, that we need to address or partner it more to have an effective climate change strategy. Next. The project I will mention is Amazon Indigenous Rights and Resources, which objective is to improve the participation of Indigenous peoples in the sustainable economic development of the Amazon, ultimately leading to the conservation of biodiversity and reduce emissions for forest loss. That are our goals on climate change. This project has 2 objectives. The first one that has to do with rights, that is Amazon Indigenous Rights and Resources, that Indigenous rights and economic interests incorporated into public and private sector development planning. So we're working with the Indigenous to planning better, to organize themselves, to have agendas and themes that can be explained in international arenas, but also national sectors, etc., and to increase their participation in the planning for climate change, defenders, and others in each country too. And the objective 2 is Indigenous enterprises equitable and sustainably scaled to local, regional, and global markets. So we're working with Indigenous initiatives to improve their capacities and to open them more to markets. And as you see below, there are many logos. This project has many partners from NGOs and indigenous from the beginning of the project as sub-awardees since we signed the contract. Next. And here I want to show you the partners. There are 22 partners in this project, 9 NGOs and 13 indigenous organizations. I want to mention some. WWF is the prime and work with other NGOs as NEST, DART is a Peruvian NGO, OPAM, IPAM, ICV, Brazilian NGOs. And for example, in Brazil, we partner with COIABI, that is the National Amazon Federation of Indigenous People, and with 2 local indigenous federations, FEPIPA and FEPOIMP. In Peru, we partner with IDESEP, that is the National Indigenous Amazon Federation, and they're subnational too in 5 provinces in the Amazon. In Colombia, we partner with OPIAC, that is the National Amazon Indigenous Federations, and also with OSIP, a local in the Putumayo area. In Ecuador, we partner with COFENIAE, that is the National Federation of the Amazon, and well, with the NGOs that work in the project for all the project, and also with COICA, that is the regional federation that is a network that includes all the national federations. So our program has the indigenous organizations as partners too from the beginning of the project. Next. How we do the governance of this project? We try to include them in the design, in the participation, in the decisions of the program. For that, we have a national steering committee that is comprised by the partner indigenous people organization in each country, the local WWF offices, and the other partner NGOs working in the country. And this is they need to make a decision for a strategic aspect of the project at the country level. They meet every month in average, but more if it's needed according to the case. We also have indigenous economic committees in each country that is comprised by the Indigenous People Organization, WWF, and NEST, the main partner for the objective to improve their indigenous enterprises. They meet to decide, for example, the terms of reference for the contest for the small grants for the indigenous economies initiatives. We're supporting 20 now indigenous economic initiatives in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And for the case of Colombia and Ecuador, since they talk or they mix the subject, they are now meeting together, the 2 committees at the same time. For the other countries, they meet separated. And we also have the regional steering committee that is also with the local indigenous federations, the National Indigenous Federation, WWF, and also what we call the Program Management Unit, and DAR, that is an NGO that works mainly for the objectives related to rights. And they meet to talk more about strategic, political, or agreements as the whole Amazonian indigenous. For example, they meet of what topics they will talk on the COP. They participate in the COP. The project is helping to organize them too. And USAID is an observer for that committee. So these committees make the governance of the project. Next. As I think Lauren mentioned already, why we partner with indigenous people? Well, indigenous people and local communities have tenure rights and or manage more than a quarter of the world's land, which interact with 40% of the land-based protected areas, intact landscape, and critical ecosystems. In the case of the Amazon, it is very clear that in indigenous lands and protected areas is where best the biomass are protected. There is a clear and growing evidence that the lands that indigenous people and local communities manage are highly effective at sequestering emissions and promoting adaptation through land and water management. And there are many actions under this intermediate illustrative include, but not limited to, co-creation, traditional practices, funding directly to indigenous peoples, through their own solutions, legal recognitions of indigenous people and their territories too, free and prior consultation, and participation in NDCs. Some of the issues that we can address through supporting indigenous people. Next. And here I want to just mention some examples of what we're doing in that regard, or we're already doing or will do. AIR, for example, have sub-awards to indigenous organizations for more than 2 million. And being sub-partners is a practice also for them to learn to be local partners, because they have to follow all the rules and regulations of USAID. We have just co-created a simplified grant with COICA, the network of the regional network for Amazonian indigenous, that is called Institutional Support to the Coordinating Body of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon Basin, to improve their administrative and financial capacity. And also we have another project since 2018 called Strengthening the Capacities of Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon, that is supporting 18 indigenous organizations, mostly at the subnational level in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Guyana, and Suriname, in their administrative and financial capacities. And also we give small grants for them to practice to manage a grant by themselves. At a bilateral in Peru, I want to mention that there's a group that is leading localization too. But well, now these days we have projects that support the 2 national and the 5 subnational federations of the Amazon. We support 91 indigenous communities in conservation and forest management. USAID Peru has developed an indigenous people engagement strategy, and we will hire early 2023 an indigenous people advisor for the mission to implement this indigenous people engagement strategy. Also, we have made a survey to see how is the relation with indigenous people partnered, and 61% of our projects actively partnered with indigenous entities, communities, organizations, enterprise federations, and 67% include them as beneficiaries. You see the difference is partner and beneficiaries. Partner is mostly that they can work together, more work together than just giving funds. And we just published an APS specifically to local organizations and did presentations on how to partner with the USAID, that of course, where the indigenous federations are, organizations are included. So as you see, the Amazon has a big opportunity to partner with indigenous people. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Monica, for that wonderful presentation. We'll come back to this in the Q&A, but I have some follow-up questions just myself about that committee structure, and I especially appreciated how you are taking an approach to balancing both sort of the administrative financial capacity strengthening as well as the more technical applied capacity strengthening with those partners. So we'll dig into that more in the Q&A. But for now, I want to transition over to our last speaker, Vivian. Vivian is the communications specialist with USAID's Office of Acquisition and Assistance. Alongside the communications team, Vivian supports the agency's mission to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in its partnerships. She received her bachelor's degree in environmental studies and a master's degree in political science from the University of Nebraska. So Vivian, over to you for our final presentation.
Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks again for having us. So I'm also a part of the industry liaison team, which is a part of the Office of Acquisition and Assistance. And essentially, we are the front door to the agency. So we're here to help partners and organizations like yourselves learn how to compete for funding with USAID. But we also are doing a lot of things within the agency to actually make sure that local organizations, we're lowering the barrier inside the agency as well. So next slide. So I know a lot of questions that people ask are just about who can compete for USAID funding. And so generally our door is open to everyone. So as you can see here are some examples. We can work with NGOs, charitable organizations, diaspora groups, etc. And we actually have over 3,000 partners, and that doesn't include the sub-partners that work with us. So if you actually visit usaid.gov under how to work with USAID, you can find more details about who we partner with and each type of these organizations. Next slide. So kind of a big question is just how we fund our awards. So the majority of USAID funds are awarded through a competitive process through contracts, grants, and cooperative agreements. As you can see here, for acquisition, USAID utilizes contracts to purchase technical service. So this can include things like goods and products from responsible parties, and these are generally US or locally based firms to implement specific programs as directed by the agency. And then for assistance, USAID utilizes grants and cooperative agreements, and usually partners with, we do, both international and national nonprofits or other types of NGOs. And then so for acquisition contracts, you can find them at sam.gov. And then for assistance, you can go to grants.gov and find them there. Next slide. Another place you can find funding opportunities, business forecasts, a really important resource for anyone that wants to work with USAID. Because we know that a lot of local organizations may need to prepare for competing for USAID funding and preparing materials and whatever else you may need in order to submit a proposal. So if you search through the business forecast, you can find the current opportunities, but you can also find the forecasted opportunities. Next slide. So we've talked about how USAID does work and how USAID funds its awards. So as a potential partner, the next step for you is to make sure that you are registered in these systems. So before applying for a contract or grant from the US government, which includes USAID, all organizations have to be registered in CAGE or NCAGE and SAM. So these registrations are free, but it does take time to prepare before you start the process. So for the UEI, which is new, this is in SAM. This is a 12-digit code confirming that your organization has a legal status. And I'm sure some of you have had some issues with UEI. Feel free to reach out to your contracting officer or AO, agreement officer, to escalate anything. Yeah, or if you also need help from us, we can also help you escalate something as well. Yeah, let's see. And then next is NCAGE, which you can also register in SAM, which is automatically generated, sorry. And then just as an FYI, it is really important to know that you can register only in English, and that the registration can take several hours to complete. So just be prepared for that. And then next slide. So some general tips for submitting a proposal. So yeah, read the entire solicitation carefully. Check the deadlines and make sure that you are submitting your proposal at the right time in the local time that is said in the proposal. There are a lot of attachments always read those carefully so you can understand what is being asked of you when you submit a proposal. With every solicitation, there is also an open question period. So this is a period of time where you can submit questions and get points of clarification from the agreement officer or the contracting officer. And then those will be answered. And then maybe there's an amendment to kind of clarify the solicitation. Again, follow the instructions outlined, as I've said before. And then one thing that we see often is that some people or some organizations will write a proposal with, having the reader assume things about their organization or their technical expertise. So be very clear in your writing, but also like just demonstrate that you're an expertise and that you are the best person to win this proposal. Again, yeah, don't make assumptions. And then lastly, this is probably the most important for many of you, is considering partnering with an organization that has experience working with USAID. So that's what we call sub-partnership. And I can kind of get into some of the resources later, and I'll put those in the chat of how you can learn more about that. Next slide. And then recently, we launched WorkWithUSAID.org. I guess now it's been almost a year, but this is a globally accessible website for anyone that's interested in working with USAID. We very much understand that there are many rules, regulations, policies, and processes that can be a little challenging for anyone. And so on this website, you can find a lot of information that's curated, relevant, and basic for you to kind of just start learning how to work with USAID. And next slide. Oh, I think there were some missing slides. But I guess with this slide, I'll kind of go over some of the features of the website. You can go to workwithusaid.org and register your organization in the partner directory. We know that many local organizations may not have the capacity to have a strong social media presence or a website. And so if you create a profile in the partner directory, you'll be able to have a visible profile that can be searchable by prime implementing partners as well as USAID staff. And that's free. And then there's also the pre-engagement assessment. This is a 48-question self-assessment where you can learn about the key operational areas that your organization will need to work with USAID. So this covers programming, program management, compliance, financial management, and HR management. And then when you take that self-assessment, you'll get a customized report that kind of shows the insights and gives you feedback on things you can work on. And then you can always check back and see how you're doing. And for anyone that's like concerned about their scoring, this is totally an informational tool for you and your organization. It doesn't come to USAID. We don't see your scoring. Yeah. And so then after you take the pre-engagement assessment, you can learn more about how you can strengthen your capacity through the library. And so there are a lot of free tools and resources on the library, guides, reports, webinars, videos, etc., where you can learn all about the key operational areas that I mentioned before and a lot more as well. There's a few in a variety of other languages, so you can feel free to check that out. Our dynamic content is on our news and insights blog. We post blogs about every week with tips from experts and stories from local organizations partnering with USAID and kind of their journey on how they did that. And then recently we launched an events page. So maybe some of you learned about this event through that webpage, but we're always putting new events for Work with USAID, but also our prime implementing partners. So if you have events in your area that you want to promote, feel free to submit an event that way. And then we also have a frequently asked question area where you can find all the questions you have about how to work with USAID. Next slide. And then just some last minute things. We know that partnering with USAID is not a one and done deal. So we want to make sure that you are able to communicate with us and stay up to date with our, our processes and the things we're doing to lower barriers for partners. So feel free to visit usaid.gov along with workwithusaid.org. And then you can sign up for our distribution list. And I'll link all these in the chat so you can all access them. You can follow us on Twitter to make sure you're in the know of events and blogs and other stories, along with our LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube. Next slide. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivian, for that presentation. As you mentioned at the end, I think every time we do a presentation or a webinar about localization, we always get a ton of questions about the just very basic, practical sort of next steps. How do we engage with USAID? So that last slide was really helpful, and I'm glad you're on the line to answer any questions that people might have about how to engage with us, because we realize it can be complicated at times. So we've been getting a lot of great questions in the Q&A box and in the chat. So I'm going to start giving some of those to our panelists. I also want to reiterate, if you have additional questions, please feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A function. You can also upvote other questions. So we'll prioritize those questions that get sort of the most thumbs up. You can see that thumbs up icon right below the question. So if you see another question that you share that you would like to hear us answer, please upvote that so we can know what would be the most useful to all of you. So to start, I think I will combine a few questions. I saw a number of questions coming in. One was from Ring about how USAID is going to align its climate change strategy with the local capacity strengthening policy. There were other questions about, from Luke, does the USAID strategy prioritize facilitating and developing the capacity of local level community or farmer organizations? I assume he's talking about the USAID climate strategy. And I think others were flagging that sometimes the biggest constraints that they might have in their projects are insufficiency of funds for capacity building, upscaling, et cetera. So a lot of good questions about capacity strengthening. I'll start and then I'll hand it over to Lauren, who might be able to speak to what this looks like from the climate strategy perspective more specifically. But as I mentioned in a response to another question, USAID is about to release later this month a brand new local capacity strengthening policy. And this policy is going to support all of our work across different sectors. So it will integrate with and support and be sort of mutually reinforcing with all of our other policies and strategies, including the climate strategy. And the goal of that policy really is to help USAID support local actors to achieve their own objectives and lead their own communities' development and shaping their future. And so it has a set of principles that will guide both the programming and the nature of those partnerships. The implementation of the policy will involve the development of guidance and resources, creating accountability and feedback mechanisms to directly inform implementation. Again, as I mentioned, supporting the integration of local capacity strengthening into all of our other policies and programs, and so on and so forth. So like many of you who have flagged this in the chat and the questions, we recognize that capacity strengthening is a really key component of this work. And so I'm sure that those local capacity strengthening and climate strategy teams are going to be working closely hand in hand to make sure that that work moves forward in that space. But maybe Lauren, I'll pass it to you if there's anything you want to add on that front.
Great. Yes, thank you, Rachel. And it's exciting. It's exciting that we have our first local capacity strengthening policy coming out next week. The launch event is on Wednesday. So that's, a great additional set of guidance, tools, and commitments to local capacity strengthening, specifically as a way to build upon the existing strengths of local actors and systems and respond to those dynamic local priorities. We've talked a lot about commitments in this climate strategy, or I did talk a lot about a focus on the commitments in the climate strategy, but of course, as Rachel began, there's a lot of agency attention more broadly to localization and local capacity. And so some of those targets that you may be familiar with for the broader agency is that by the end of fiscal year 2025, we're hoping that at least, or we're aiming for at least a quarter of our obligations to go to local organizations, excluding operating expenses, personal service contractors, G2G, public interest. Anyway, there's a focus for 25% of obligations to go to local organizations. But even more than that, there's an aim for 50% of USAID activities across our development and humanitarian portfolio to put local communities in the lead, to co-design a project, set priorities, drive implementation, or evaluate the impact of our programs. So those are tall orders. That's challenging, but something that we think is critically important, and of course will involve attention to capacity strengthening. That's also relevant to our climate strategy. While I featured a lot of the different portions, one of the intermediate results that I didn't highlight earlier, but is very critical to this question about capacity, is our intermediate result 2.3, which is about strengthening responsive, transparent governance and citizen engagement for effective climate action. So that's one in particular where we lean into building the capacity of individuals, particularly marginalized and underrepresented groups, to participate meaningfully in climate action, and working with partners to improve that technical capacity, including through education and training. There are many other places throughout the climate strategy where, especially related to our systems change strategic objective, where we're looking at ways to facilitate capacity building of various partners for co-design and these demand-driven climate information services and so on. So hopefully that answered that question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lauren. I saw that Chihenyo was responding to one question in the Q&A function, so be sure to take a look at those questions that have been answered there as well. I wanted to try to capture some of the other questions that were for Chihenyo as well. A lot of thanks for your presentation and for all of the positive benefits that you were sharing, by the way, Chihenyo. Could you also speak to whether the livestock project promotes mobile or sedentary, or both sedentary and mobile pastoralism, and how you're engaging vis-a-vis those communities? Chihenyo, I'm not sure if you can speak to that.
Well, Rachel, I can contribute to some response. The project that I highlighted today was really looking at the conservancies, but the conservancies are not just managing livestock, but they also are looked at as a local-led approach towards development. So they do have many other benefits that they provide at that level. In terms of using more indigenous and modern approaches towards management of livestock, we would say that because of integrating holistic rangeland management approaches across these landscapes, the livestock do move because they have allocated particular grazing lands. I must also point that we have leveraged other programs to support holistic rangeland management. We have also leveraged with Severe. Severe does archiving of grazelands, and that helps them to also know which areas to move their livestock. So because of utilizing and leveraging all other programs that we have that support better landscape or ecosystem management, we're able to support the communities to really integrate ecosystem-based management, but also ensure that carrying capacity stock counts are actually taken, so that even during drought events, they're able to manage it. But the issue here is trying to scale these efforts to a much larger level, or to cover a much larger area. And that's where we're trying to also ensure that other technical offices are able to contribute towards utilizing the Conservancy as an approach to development. Over. Thanks.
Thank you, Chihenyo. There were a couple of questions too that I believe came in during Monica's presentation. I'm sure some of the other panelists might be able to speak to it, but Leslie was asking, does this project, again, I think she was referring to Monica's presentation, does this project report against the CBLD-9 indicator? And how do you determine improved performance with this indicator? And then a kind of related question, do you use any indicators to track how international NGOs like WWF are moving closer to a locally led approach?
Well, I don't know specifically a CTTP8 indicator, what is it about, but I guess it's about how to measure that the local organizations are improving. Specifically with the Skyowa, this project that works with 18 indigenous federations in the Amazon, they have a very structured way to measure the advance using the ITOCA tool, improving technical organization capacity tool that they measure the before and the after in several aspects of their administrative and financial arena and communications. And they have the initial workshops with the organizations themselves on what they want, how they situate themselves, with the participation of many people of the organization. And they also contrast if everybody agrees on the response and everybody agrees in where they are. So they have developed this tool actually to have this indicator for us to see how the main objective of the project, that is improving the capacities of this organization, is measured from the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. And they also make an analysis of how different organizations improve according also to their goals, because some of them, for example, the oldest one are 50 years old, and they don't want to improve in status, for example. They want to improve in youth participation in their directives or other aspects. So they're customize the goals according to each organization, and they measure it every, let's say, 3 times during the project. That ITOCA tool has been very appreciated by the indigenous organizations, and some of them use them with the subnational organizations. We have used that also in the co-design of the project with COICA, the regional organizations, for them to measure themselves, what were their needs and how we can put those needs as part of the project that they're just start with us of strengthening the capacities of COICA and their subnational organizations. As part of AIR, in the beginning of the project, WWF made an assessment of each of the national organizations, how they were in these aspects, and also in technical aspects of defenders or others, and what were their needs or their plans to improve that. And those are part of the agenda of the project. I will say that I will highly suggest that when you do some assessment of the organization and thinking in both projects, we work with them a lot for them to identify themselves, how they feel they are in their administrative and financial capacities. They are very honest in saying, we don't know how to do this, we don't know how to do that. The other thing is, along the project, to be in partner with USAID, its rules, regulation, indicators, and processes, that is hard also for them. In some cases, some others have more experiences, because in the past they have received funds from other big organizations. For example, how to measure indicators is a learning process. How to do with the accounting is a learning process. How to do with the reporting, what are the themes or the ways we want to report. So that being sub-awardee is a learning process. It's hard sometimes to measure how much they progress, but they tell you anecdotically how they have helped this to plan better. Now we meet this way. Now we organize our minutes of the meetings this way. They tell you more in an anecdotal way. For some organizations, still very hard to have a tool very systematically organized. But I think in general, they have improved compared to, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Although we have worked with indigenous organizations as beneficiary in the past in the regional program with the previous regional program that was called ICA, Initiative for the Conservation of the Andes Amazon. I think this project directed specifically to indigenous people are doing more on measuring these aspects.
Thank you, Monica. That was great. I love that response, and I'd also love to learn more about that tool that you mentioned for directly engaging with local partners and understanding their own capacities and room for growth, room for development, and ways that they want to strengthen their own capacity. That's great. I think we have time for just about one more question. So I'm going to cheat and bundle a few questions together that I think came up in response to Vivian's presentation. Some of them more just kind of clarifying questions. So from Leslie, are UEIs also for subs or just for primes? And then from Judith, there's also a follow-up question to that if you see it in the chat, Vivian, and can address it. From Judith, what does USAID mean by legal status? Could it be tribal legal recognition, or does it need to be by the national government? Sorry to put you on the spot, Vivian, if you don't know for that second one.
Yeah, UEI, subs do need to have a UEI. And so we recommend that you work through the prime as well as the contracting officer or agreement officer. SAM.gov has like a few different resources on how to do that, but there's also resources on WorkWithUSAID.org on how to do that. The other question about legal status. So it's kind of a tricky question. So everybody has to be registered in SAM.gov or have a cage and NCAGE code. But if you're a local organization, there might be different requirements in the country about legal status. I'm not actually sure about the tribal status. I'd have to come back to that one.
Great, thank you, Vivian. And if I could, I don't know if this is an easy or quick question to answer. I saw it got some upvotes for either Lauren or Anne. Will there be country-specific USAID climate strategies? I'm not sure if that's in the works.
Anne, do you want to? Yeah, basically, yes. So part of what we are doing as part of the climate strategy is ensuring that for every country, we use our own USAID processes. So we have these country development cooperation strategies, and for each of them, there's a requirement to do a climate annex where we're digging into those. And we're also working, of course, with the interagency in coordinating, across the board for whole of government responses. Of course, all of these are driven still by the attention to local priorities. So while these may be USAID plans that you'll be able to see, they're of course informed with and developed in coordination with local partners.
And maybe can I add one to answer a lot of the questions that we have on procurement and working with USAID? Would really recommend for local organizations also is to talk to mission counterparts who know we have a climate strategy that's prioritizing working with local partners. We have all of the information you've just gotten today. So highlighting those points in your conversations with missions so that you can work together to advance these objectives that I think we all are working for. So often there's a lot of try to answer some of these questions. A lot of the development of programming comes from those missions. So really important to talk to your USAID mission counterparts. So hope that helps, and excited to try to follow up with some of these other questions. But I think back to you, Rachel.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Lauren. I think that's a great note to end on. I know we're just a minute over time, so I want to thank everybody who joined us today, everyone who's still on the line. Thank you for staying with us for an hour and 15 minutes. I want to thank Meredith and Sophie and the entire Climate Links team for organizing and facilitating this event. Again, thank you to our speakers, Lauren, Anne, Vivian, Chihenyo, and Monica. It was so great and enriching to hear your different perspectives on this issue, and especially the specific examples from Kenya and South America. And then, of course, having that sort of practical next steps perspectives from the Office of Acquisition and Assistance on how we can move forward and partner more together. You're going to be receiving a link for a survey right after this webinar closes. So please take a few minutes to respond to that. It's really helpful for us, helps inform future programming, and lets us know how we did. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day wherever you are. Thanks all.
Thank you.
So we're going to close down our webinar for today. Thank you again all for participating. We've captured your chat and your questions. The webinar will close just momentarily. And so again, we really do appreciate your participation. Please do know that the recording is already live on Climate Links. So you can go and view that now. PowerPoints and resources will be added shortly. We look forward to your participation in the survey to hear more about what folks are interested in for the future. So thanks again for all your participation.